Super Bowl Sunday is less than a week away, and anyone that knows me knows I'm going to find a way to make this about college football. So in this video, we're going to be ranking the top 10 players in the Super Bowl based exclusively off of how good they were when they played in college. Obviously, this is typically going to be a pretty stacked list because there's a lot of guys that were big-time contributors at the college level that are on these rosters in the Super Bowl. And this year, it was a particularly tough pick. There are some really good players here. And so we'll start with some honorable mentions. Nakobe Dean from Georgia, one of several Georgia players that were in consideration here because the Eagles' defense is stacked with them. Kelee Ringo is another one you could even give an honorable mention to right now. Just all great defensive players. Juju Smith at USC was a dominant receiver. Hollywood Brown, another guy that had a pair of 1,000-yard receiving seasons at Oklahoma before he dipped. Matt Araiza won the award for the best punter in college football his final season at San Diego State. Kenny Pickett was a Heisman candidate his final year at Pitt. Just didn't have the full career at the high level that you would like to see of a guy in this list. And then finally, A.J. Brown, who I think is especially underrated because what he was doing was against SEC defenses as well. So those guys all deserve an honorable mention. They're all great. They could all just as easily be justified as being on the top 10. We'll start off the list with number 10, which is going to be Felix Anudike-Uzomah from Kansas State. Hopefully I pronounced that last name correctly, but he's a guy that I really think is unsung and a little underrated as a defender. He had 19 and a half sacks in his final 2 seasons with the Wildcats. He forced 8 fumbles in those 2 seasons. One season he forced 6 fumbles, basically averaging a forced fumble every other game, which I think is a particularly underrated part of his game. He had 27 tackles for loss and over 100 total tackles throughout his career. He's a guy that was a beast for Kansas State. He won a bunch of all-conference honors for that, and there's a reason he's in the NFL, and I think he's a guy that a lot of people won't have on their list just because they simply aren't familiar with his game. Coming in at number 9, we have Cooper DeJean, who has defied all logic by being an elite white defensive back in college. He was an All-American in his junior season. He had 3 pick sixes in the 2022 season, 120 total tackles, which is really impressive for his position. He was a true lockdown cornerback for Iowa, and he was also an excellent special teams player and could really make a difference returning punts, returning kicks, you name it. Cooper DeJean was doing it at Iowa, a super impressive college career, and now a household name on the Eagles already. People really excited to finally have another white cornerback that's actually good. Coming in at number 8, we have Landon Dickerson. I wanted to show some love to some of the big boys on this list, particularly on the offensive line. And to be honest, there's not a ton of super decorated offensive linemen in college in the Super Bowl. Landon Dickerson is the most so. He was a consensus All-American in his final season in Alabama, and he led the Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. He also won the 2020 Remington Award, which went to the most outstanding center for the season. So Landon Dickerson has a pretty decorated career, which I think is able to get him this spot. He started his career at Florida State, where he was on and off because of injuries, didn't do as much as he probably wanted to do, and it was at Alabama where he had his best seasons. Coming in at number 7, we have DeAndre Hopkins. Now, a casual might look at some of Hopkins' early stats in his career and say, well, what is he doing on this list? But if you look at what he did in his final seasons and actually understand the context of how good he was at Clemson, you'll easily understand his spot on this list. He had over 3,000 receiving yards through his 3 seasons. He had 1,400 yards and 18 touchdowns in his final year at Clemson, which 18 receiving touchdowns is bonkers. And he had 50 receptions and 600 yards as a freshman in the ACC. So I do not overlook DeAndre Hopkins, and I know just how good this guy was when he played with the Tigers. Coming in at number 6, we have Patrick Mahomes. Now, this spot is definitely going to upset some people for a couple of reasons. Number 1, Patrick Mahomes is obviously the best player that exists that plays football right now, but this is specifically only what he did in college. And statistically, he's the most impressive player on this list, but it requires the context of Texas Tech, which is the offensive scheme they ran, which involved airing it out, an air raid offense, just throwing the ball like 60 times a game. And they also had a Swiss cheese defense. So he had the ball in his hands more. He had more opportunities to make plays. And that was the reality of his time at Texas Tech. They weren't great teams. They were teams that missed bowl games at time. But you look at what he did, 16, 36, and 41 touchdown passes in his 3 seasons. That's pretty ridiculous numbers. He was throwing for over 350 yards per game across his whole career and ends his career with over 11,000 passing yards from just 3 seasons. That is extremely impressive, obviously, and it's the reason Patrick Mahomes gets the number 6 on this list. Coming in at number 5, we have Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter is an elite defensive tackle from Georgia and a huge piece behind their back-to-back national titles in 2021 and 2022. He was one of the best defenders on 2 national champion teams, which is really impressive. A consensus All-American in 2022. He had 83 tackles, 19 tackles for loss, and 6 sacks in his career, which doesn't sound like a lot for a defensive end. This dude was a defensive tackle. Racking up those stats is pretty crazy for a position that typically doesn't get all of the stats that showcase their true effect they're having on the game. Coming in at number 4, we've got another player that played at 2 different schools. It's Jalen Hurts from Alabama and Oklahoma. He was a Heisman candidate at both schools. He ends up getting beat out at Alabama by Tua Tagovailoa, and he goes to Oklahoma where he finishes second in Heisman voting in the 2019 season behind only Joe Burrow. If it was any other season, he might have just very well won the Heisman that year. He has 123 career touchdowns, including plenty on the ground. He has over 3,000 career rushing yards and over 9,000 career passing yards. He was a true dual threat playmaker, and he did some pretty fantastic stuff at his time with the Sooners and both with the Crimson Tide as well. Coming in at number 3, we have Saquon Barkley from Penn State. Just an absolute animal in his time with the Nittany Lions. He was behind their big turnaround early under James Franklin. He had over 1,000 yards rushing in each of his 3 seasons in college, 51 career rushing touchdowns, and over 3,800 rushing yards in his 3 seasons. He finished his 4th in the Heisman voting in the 2017 season and was a candidate throughout the entire season, and he was also an All-American in 2017. I don't really need to tell you how good Saquon was because most of you remember how good Saquon was. He was a true weapon and a guy that you never wanted to see lining up on the other side of the field. Coming in at number 2, we've got another Georgia Bulldog. This one is Jordan Davis. Also a defensive tackle, a true game wrecker, just like Jalen Carter, but a guy whose impact was even more potent somehow. He was a guy that finished 9th in the 2022 Heisman voting, which is ridiculous for a defensive tackle to be finishing that high. And he won the Chuck Bednarik Award for the best defensive player in college football, effectively the Heisman of the defense. He was a consensus All-American. He finished his career with 91 tackles, 13 tackles for loss, and 7 sacks in his career. But again, like I said, the counting stats don't matter for the players in this position. Their impact is just on film, and when you're actually watching the games, the way they are moving bodies up at the front and making a true impact. Coming in at number 1, we have Devonta Smith, the only Heisman Trophy winner in this Super Bowl and a guy that definitely deserves the number 1 spot, not just for that, but for many other things, including a walk-off touchdown to win the Natty as a true freshman. He obviously wins the Heisman. He has over 3,000 receiving yards in his final 2 seasons, including 1,800 in his final season, in which he played only SEC and playoff competition. I don't think people understand just how dominant his final season there was. He was a consensus All-American. He won the Maxwell and Walter Camp Awards and obviously the Heisman Trophy. So he just swept everything. And Devonta Smith was just an absolute monster in his final season at Alabama. And there's a reason he won the Heisman Trophy. There's a reason he's the number 1 player in the Super Bowl from how they played in college football. So there you have it. There's the 10 best Super Bowl players based on how good they were in college football. Let me know what you think of my list and who you think is missing / who you would add to this list. It's going to be a little subjective for some of the additions. I think when you get towards the top, it's a little bit more concrete who should be there. But let me know down in the comments, who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl? What do you think it's going to be like? And which of these players do you think are going to make a big impact to decide that football game?